Welcome to another ASTQB webinar. Today we'll be talking about retail and e-commerce, digital transformation, and what it means for software QA. Today we're going to address this key question: how do you keep customers coming back? The answer? Well, by offering the highest quality retail and e-commerce systems and customer experiences. But of course, that is easier said than done. In this ASTQB webinar, Phil Liu will discuss the digital transformation and what it means for software QA in retail and e-commerce. Those who are successful in deploying resources into software testing at the right time and at the right place will win the race toward higher quality systems and keep customers coming back. We'll accept questions at any time, but Phil will answer them at the end, but you can type those into your questions box at any point. And we look forward to hearing from Phil. Phil, thank you for joining us today, and take it away.
Thanks, Dave. It's great to be here. First, just want to thank ASTQB for having me, and let's get moving here. So, first, a couple house rules. I think Dave really talked about them already, but the hashtag there for the webinar is e-commerce software testing. This just a little bit about myself. I'm the CEO and founder of XBOsoft, and we specialize in software quality stuff. And but as far as myself, I'm really a passionate cyclist, and I love traveling. I can't count how many countries I've been to. I think maybe 60, 70. So, but if you think about it, there's actually over 200 countries, believe it or not. So, just a little bit about my company. Better software needs better testing, and that's why we're here today to talk about some of the experiences that I've gained over the last couple of years in working with our clients on retail and e-commerce. And I think, part of the title of the webinar is about the digital transformation, but it really has no definition. And so this is a definition that I found on the web, and you can see the reference on the bottom left-hand side. And I've kind of made the real key parts in blue. The first one is integration, right? So that means that there's a lot of pieces and parts that need to be put together. And when you think of e-commerce, it's really a lot of things now that are involved, not just a website. And of course, when you think about digital, digital literally means ones and zeros, but that means transmission of ones and zeros, which means software. And then I highlighted the word operate because that's critical in software, that it work correctly all the time because businesses are depending on it. And of course, to deliver value. And the last one I highlighted there was customers, because our customers, or what we call our end users, are really the ones that we're trying to satisfy. So for retail, the digital transformation means much more than a website. We're going to talk about each of the little pieces and components and how they fit together in the customer experience. So, just a little bit more about the digital transformation as it works in retail. The digital transformation is really about more than a website, like I said, but it combines the store experience. So when you go to the store with mobile and web, and puts them all together. And on top of that, the social media activity, that's really important too, because that's what's going to make a product or store popular or not, or enable you to get feedback from your customers on what products to carry or what products not to carry. And then, there's a lot more things that you can collect. It used to be about collecting customer loyalty data in terms of having a membership card when you checked out, so they could attribute certain things that you bought to you. But there's now so many different sensors and devices for retail organizations to collect data. It's just amazing the kind of things that you can do, and to be able to leverage all that data and make some prescriptive analytics to really create, a customized experience for the end user. And then, of course, a home delivery ecosystem, um, meaning that customers are notified when something is delivered to them, sometimes even by the hour, and when it was delivered, when it was left. And that really goes into things like lockers, personalized lockers. I've seen some people have lockers now on their doorstep to avoid theft. And these things are all connected to Wi-Fi and so on, so people know when the delivery man puts something in that home locker. Um, and of course, going upwards and backwards towards the supply chain and inventory as well, and knowing when to reorder so you can have just-in-time management of your inventory to minimize carrying charges. And then, something new is really having dynamic pricing based on the inventory that you have, the demand and supply, as well as your competitors. So there's a lot of pieces and parts now that are being, digitized, and I guess you could say softwareized. You've heard the term, software is eating the world. It really is, and I think retail is one of the places that's really taking charge in that in a fast way. The original phrase "software eating the world" by Mark Andreessen. Some of the examples he gave were, as you know, like Amazon is not a bookstore; it's a software company, and the same thing with Netflix. It's not a DVD company anymore; it's a software company. So let's first start with brick and mortar retail, and so I'll just put a question out there to the audience. When was the last time that you went to a shopping mall? I can't even remember the last time I went to a shopping mall other than when I went to the movies, which happened to be in a shopping mall. So I would, if I were to take a poll, if anybody wants to respond, feel free to, because I actually think that probably very few people have gone to shopping malls, and sometimes I drive by them and I wonder to myself, what are they going to do with all these shopping malls? Well, they're going to close them down and repurpose them for sure. So let's look at some of the things that the digital transformation is taking away, some of the problems that we've had. So it used to be that there was no parking, right? And you had long lines to pay. So a lot of times we had that. I've been to stores where I try to find something and I can't find what I want, or maybe there's nobody around to help me find what I want. Or maybe they're out of my size, right? So a lot of times I find they're out of my size. And then of course when I'm in the mall, if I stay more than 15 minutes, I usually get tired of walking around. And then at the end, I can't find my car. I'm sure that some of you all have run into that problem where you can't find your car, or maybe it's just me. I don't know. So transforming the old experience into the new experience. So let's look at this. The first one is, I talked about no parking, right? So instead of trying to park, you really start online with research, right? So today I was looking at patio furniture, and I went to different sites and I looked at different prices and I figured out what I wanted to get, and it was quite a long process. So instead of going to some place and walking around all these stores, I spend about an hour online and do research. Instead of not finding what I want, I now want pictures and I want descriptions, detailed descriptions, including things like what the frame of the furniture is made of. And then I also want to look at reviews. I want to look at reviews in terms of, the colors. Is the sun protective fabric, does that really work? Things like that. as opposed to not having anybody around to help me. And instead of walking around the whole store, I just click a few different places once I decide what I want, and I find the best price as well as the best, I guess you could say, that a vendor or company that I trust. Um, and of course, I go to checkout, and hopefully there's no problems. And instead of leaving with a handful of shopping bags, I just have it delivered to my door. So you can see that the retail experience and the customer experience has really transformed. Probably just in the last 5 years, it's really changed. And so, there's a lot of companies now. I saw a Sears store the other day in Boston, and I was wondering to myself, how long is that going to be there? What kind of experience are they creating for their customers that's different, and what kind of brick and mortar companies are going to survive? And so I started thinking about the stores that I had been in recently, and one of them was Best Buy. And I think that they have survived Amazon. And I think that one of the big reasons that they've survived is that they have integrated services after the sale with Geek Squad. I don't know how many of you have used Geek Squad or not, but that, along with integrating Geek Squad into the purchase experience, as well as making it more fun to actually be in the store, has been part of their strategy. And so if you have a retail e-commerce website and you have a brick and mortar locations as well, it's really important to combine the experience together. So if you look at Best Buy's website, you can see how they combine that in-store experience with the website experience. So I think what's important, in terms of integrating the journey, when you think about the technologies involved in combining brick and mortar with the online experience, one of the things is, you start and you do research on your mobile, or you buy on mobile, like I was saying earlier. Here's an example on the iPhone with Amazon. And then what they do now is they have these lockers, right? And so lockers can either be an Amazon locker, or you can actually have a multi-vendor locker. I've seen lockers in apartment complexes and so on, where any delivery person can go and deliver something to you in your locker for your apartment and keeps it secure. And so as QA and testers, we have to think about what would be the top user stories and what are the technologies that are involved in these retail lockers. I'll just leave that question open for you right now. Maybe give you 30 seconds. If you want to type into the question panel, what are the technologies that are involved in retail lockers? Let's just have a little participation here. And what kind of technology do you think are involved in retail lockers? I give maybe if you could take 20 seconds and type some stuff in, that would be great, so we can have some participation here. What do you think there, Dave?
Oh, well, encryption would seem to come into play if you're transmitting passwords, perhaps. Is that one that would work?
That's one, yeah. The authentication of who you are when you want to pick up your package. There's two-factor authentication, multi-factor authentication. So there's a lot of security type technologies. There's scanning technologies, right? Because you're going to scan a code, usually with your phone. Of course, there's mobile technology and wireless technology. And then, what are the things that could go wrong? And there's tons of things that could go wrong. So you really have to think through, as QA engineers and software testers, we really need to think a lot about the negative test cases that would cause things to go wrong, which could be, would kill the transaction. maybe the password was delivered incorrectly, or maybe they didn't get it in a certain time. Maybe performance was not very good and they didn't get the password. A lot of things that go wrong when you're integrating all these different technologies together. And so as software testers, it's up to us to really think of all these user stories and use cases. And it just makes, our whole realm of thinking is much different than just looking at a website or looking at a piece of software and see if it works or not. There's a lot of different pieces, and sometimes they're even hardware or embedded software that are part of the equation. So I'm going to go through a couple things here. So the whole experience starts with a website, right? So you look at a website, you do some research, like I said, and it used to be that the only thing that people were concerned about was eyeballs. So how many people they would track, how many users came to the site, where they clicked, how long they were spent on this product or that product, and things like that. And then they were concerned about how long did somebody spend on the site. And so that was all part of, success, right? How long does somebody spend there? And, where do they click? What is their path? Things like that. Those are the original types of metrics that were created and tracked with Google Analytics. And then, of course, did they buy or not? And so, now we don't just have this simple transaction that we're looking for, and we need to think about, like I was saying, an integrated experience for the customer. And so when you think about it, if you look at the top, I talked about the research that people do, right? And then after the research, like I said with my patio furniture that I was looking at today, after the research, they may visit the store, and then they may purchase. I think the critical thing is the purchase or not purchase, and then using and returning. So those are some of the things that really have to be thought through. And one of the things that made Zappos very successful, and one of the reasons that Amazon bought them was because they were successful at the return and exchange part of the equation, and that part of this customer journey. So in the return or exchange, they offered free shipping because they knew that that was a big obstacle for people buying shoes if you buy the wrong size. And so, they knew their customers and they knew what worries their customers had. And so depending on what domain you're in, you have to think very carefully about your users and your customers and what are their concerns. Maybe they're probably not concerned about the same size, or maybe they are if you're selling clothes or something like that. But, clothes are even different than shoes, because shoes you've got 9, 9.5, and 10, whereas clothes maybe you have small, medium, and large. And so you have a lot smaller margin of error in shoes. So those are the kind of details that you need to think about in terms of integrating and thinking about your customer journey. And so just to go through another example of how digital transformation has affected the Starbucks journey. You start on your mobile phone, and you try to avoid lines. So maybe you order ahead of time, or you pay at the register with your phone. And then one of the things that I find that they didn't quite think through that carefully was that a lot of people would be ordering with their mobile phones. And so what happens is you have people standing around waiting for their order that they had on that one end of the counter. And what happens is, how do you know if it's yours or not? Sometimes if you miss it and they called your name out 2 minutes ago and you just got there, that may prevent you from sitting around and having a drink of coffee, right? So a lot of these different use cases need to be thought through, not only as part of the buying process in terms of the mobile experience, but what happens after that in order to really satisfy the customer. So, what are the primary use cases? What kinds of things can go wrong? All of these things need to be thought through as part of the whole experience. And, the Starbucks case, and I think I mentioned Best Buy, those are kind of easy to think of because they're things that we do in our everyday life. We go buy things, we have coffee, things like that. But when you're talking about other types of domains like healthcare or, say, accounting, we're working with a company that does fish management. So they do fish farm software and trying to understand all of the things in fish farms and these sensors that are in the water and how much they feed the fish and how many fish are in the tank. And it's just incredible the amount of data and business rules and sensors that are available to do that kind of stuff. And same thing with all these other very specialized domains. We really, as software testers, have to be, what I say, empathetic in terms of really thinking about the viewpoint of the end user and really digging deeply into thinking about that software and what the end users are. So I mentioned the one thing about the different margin of error for a retail e-commerce site selling shoes versus selling clothes that are small, medium, and large. So, think about those kinds of things when you create your user stories for people that are going to be returning things and to make it easy for them. And so when I think about all these tests that we need to do, I kind of put together this model of the different types of testing that we need to think about when going through our retail e-commerce software testing journey. So I'm going to step through each of these and spend a few minutes on each, and then go back to the beginning kind of and close things up. The first one is mobile testing, and you see this pie chart on the right. I had one of our testers put this pie chart together, and I found it really, really interesting that such a small percentage of the defects were server-side defects, and most of them were defects that were related to the mobile device. And so I think that when we test for the e-commerce customer journey, we really need to think about what our mobile strategy is. So the next question I have, or that I hope that you can answer in the question panel, would be, how many mobile devices are you testing? So I'll give you a couple seconds to put that in. I hope that you guys can respond and let me know in terms of your mobile lab and how you approach that, how many devices you test. What do you think? Anybody talking about the devices they test or don't test, or how many, Dave?
Yeah, the answer we're seeing, ranges a little bit, but several people are saying 3, and then, there's the whole issue. There's several models of phones and tablets across different, the iOS
Right.
and Android. You've got iPhone versus iPad, Samsung. My own personal response was going to be, if I had an infinite amount of time, I'm pretty sure I could fill that up with all of the different models out there.
Yeah, well, that's the the big question that a lot of our clients ask is, well, what should I be testing, or what can you test for me, or what can I test that would give me 90% coverage? And I think that the answer is really in analyzing your user base. You can collect all of that data right now in terms of what users are using in accessing your website. So that would be my recommendation, would be to really collect some real data and see what your users are using, and take those, and you probably might be able to get 90% coverage even with 5 to 6 devices, depending on the users that you have, your user group. The next thing is compatibility testing, and this when we had the client server environment, we had to test, application servers as well as database servers. And then we had different operating systems on the client and different versions of Windows and so on. And I used to think that was going to get simpler when we had a web-based and browser-based software, but it really didn't get simpler. And the reason it didn't get simpler is because there's other pieces now. So, there's not only servers involved, but there's different browser versions. And then we have other pieces, like I was talking about in terms of the customer journey, pieces that include tablets, mobile, watch, and even your laptop. And there's just a lot of different pieces now that we have to think about. I had a friend of mine send me a email that from Costco where he was on his mobile phone, and I wish I could have brought that, gotten a screenshot of this. He was on his mobile phone, so he sent me an email of a product he was looking at. And so I looked at the email on my browser on my laptop, and I had this little tiny picture of something that I could barely see because it had not understood that I was on my laptop rather than my mobile phone, and it was sending me a picture from his mobile phone. And it was just really weird. So, those kinds of tests need to be thought through in terms of, what the users are doing. That was an obvious use case that they didn't think about, I guess. But that's those kind of things that we need to do as software testers. Functionality testing, I'm not talking about just real basic functionality. All of our end users and customers expect our software to work now. And so what I'm talking about is a real integrated journey, and I'll talk about this example I have here on the right. You'll see that it is a little placard on the table. And what the placard says is, scan this to order your food. So you take an application out on your mobile phone, and you scan this QR code, and up comes the menu. And so you get this menu, and you order your food, and you pay through your mobile phone, and your food is delivered by somebody in just a few minutes. It's just incredible the amount of integration that has to take place to make that happen. And China has it done before we do, And so when I think about that, think of all the different pieces and parts that have to work in order to make that happen. So we have the initial scanning. So that has to work because the scanning they have to know exactly what table to deliver your food to. So each barcode, each scanning is, each QR code is not only brings up the menu, but also knows where your location is. So that's important. And the next piece is, so when you order that food, the ones that are not available, those have to be grayed out, because otherwise you're going to pay for something, and then later they have to come to your table and say, oh, we don't have that today. So that has to be brought in from the inventory or the supply in the kitchen. And then after you order, then you have to pay. And so that whole payment gateway piece has to be put together. And then after you pay and you get your food, then there's a sheet, there's a little form to fill out to rate the food. And then you can share that with your friends and so on. So that whole process really requires a lot of thinking through and thinking about all the things that that can go wrong. And there's the normal parts about trying to sell them expensive things. So you might want to put the most expensive or most popular foods in certain locations in your menu and so on. And so the typical sales type approach to the application holds here as well. Performance testing. I mentioned having a line to wait in to pay or trying to find somebody. I think the secret to performance testing for retail sites is the same as in any performance testing, and that is really weeding through and trying to figure out what data you need to analyze and how you can use that data to find bottlenecks. And I put a little example here in terms of some work that we did recently with a client, and what we found, and this is not a retail site, but what we found was that with 40, when we jumped up to 40 concurrent users executing a certain scenario, that they had a average response time of 4,500 milliseconds, or 4.5 seconds, versus with 30 users where it was much less than that. And so this is a typical thing to be thinking about and looking at. But what's really interesting is that you really need to dig deeper to find the real problems in order to improve. So what we did was, and I've crossed out the real transaction names because that would kind of indicate who the client was, but we really looked at the 3 slowest transactions, or the 3 slowest, you could probably think of it as clicks or forms they filled out or things like that. The 3 slowest things that they did in terms of performance. And so when you get to this level of detail, looking at a user story or a use case, this is the kind of thing that really helps you to nail down where your problems are. And so as software testers, when we're looking at performance, or when we're really designing performance test cases and performance scenarios to execute, we need to be like investigative reporters or detectives and really correlating things, holding all variables constant and changing one, and thinking about these kinds of things so that we can find these problems. And these kinds of things are really valuable. The 40 user thing, that's valuable too, but I don't think it's as valuable as these kinds of things. So finding specific small pieces that have slow performance, and that enables the software developers to go and fix things and make things different. The next one is payment, and you can just think of all the things that can go wrong in payment. Sometimes users clicking twice by accident and so on, and the different levels of security that are required. And one of the things I mentioned before was trust, and there's a lot of things that companies now are putting in place to change the usability, and we'll get to usability soon, of software on the web for retail sites to make customers and end users trust them. So what would be, I'll just stop here and say, what would be the most common negative test that you think would be critical? Let's spend about 30 seconds to a minute and think about the negative tests that you think are necessary when you're executing a payment transaction. What are people saying there, Dave?
Yeah, some good thoughts here. Declined cards, incorrect card authentication, payment networks being down. Obviously you don't want to undercharge. You want to make sure that the correct amount is going through, and certainly if there's a refund situation, you want to make sure that is probably rock solid. You don't want to refund someone $2 million on a $10 refund situation.
That's for sure. Yeah, those are some really good examples. Great.
Clicking a couple others they mentioned, clicking the back button, packet loss. So yeah, there's a pretty good range of them.
Yeah, great. Let's see here. Yeah, here's another one that I got the other day. So this is kind of scary. So, we don't want to let payment cause friction, confusion, or fear. That's what I thought about after this. The next one is security, and I was thinking about this the other day in terms of how a lot of software and companies are requiring two-factor authentication and even multi-factor authentication. And this is combined with payment, but also the protection of data. So it's not just payment that's really a security issue, but the data issue. So scanning to identify vulnerabilities early, often, is really, really important. And it only gets more complicated with mobile because mobile offers another intrusion point for the bad guys. So in addition to TFA, two-factor authentication, we have multi-factor authentication, and there's lots of new security methods. Blockchain is coming as well that helps us to protect things, but the bad guys are always doing their research as well. The next thing is big data testing, and I talk about this because I think it's important to understand as software testers the things that are important in data. So, data for testing is one of the biggest things that could be a bottleneck in getting our testing efforts started. And the reason it's a bottleneck, that it's a big deal and will be a bigger and bigger problem in the future, is because of the types of data. There's so many different types of data, and protecting that data, we need to make sure that it's aggregated at the right levels. And in terms of collecting data from our customers, we really need to think why we're collecting and take a step a little higher in terms of what we're doing with that data and why we're collecting it. Because maybe we don't need that data. And then, if we're going to be using, if our marketing folks and so on are going to be using that data, then we really need to warn them about data quality in terms of getting rid of anomalies and bad data. And there's a lot of companies out there right now that specialize in data quality and identifying anomalies and bad data. So those things that we can get into as software testers, or at least have a good understanding of. In terms of regression and automated testing, it's the same old question, really. It's really about where to test with automation and where not to test. And it's the same in this industry and this type of application. But what makes it more complicated is that because there are so many more pieces, and the user journey and use cases can cross different systems, that makes the test automation have to include a lot of API testing as well, because you're going to be crossing over to maybe you'll be testing on your website or your retail website, but you have to go through a whole story that includes an interface to an inventory system or something like that. So that makes automation a little bit more complicated and really requires you to have good knowledge of how to do API testing. The next one I'm going to talk about here is 508 accessibility testing. And you may not think it's really that important because it's only for federal government procurement requirements, and if you want to know more, you can go to this site here. But I think it's important to let everybody have access to what the software that we provide, whether it be retail or not. Why not, right? And so the question to why not, the answer to why not, well, you may say, oh, it's too expensive, we can't do that. And so I just wanted to provide a couple things about Section 508 and what it is in terms of just some real basic introduction to it. It's not really that hard, and it makes really good sense. The first one is having text equivalence or alt descriptions for photos, images, and non-textual elements. The second one is making it possible to fill out online forms using assistive technology or just using the keyboard. So in case they can't click around with a mouse, they can just use the keyboard. And then, of course, suitable background and contrast colors for people that are colorblind. And then the last one is making it possible to skip over long lists and navigation links to get to the main content. In other words, just enabling shortcuts. Those are the four key things in 508 accessibility. The last one I'm going to discuss is usability testing. This is really close to my heart. And one of the things that, and I've mentioned this before in terms of having confusion and friction, those are the kinds of things that stop people from buying. And so the only problem is that usability testing is often overlooked. And the reason it's overlooked is we think it's too expensive or it's too much trouble. And there's a lot of really basic heuristic tests that you can do in the usability area. And a heuristic test is really just going through the software as an end user and going through actual user story. And the funny thing is that I put this picture here on the right, and does anybody know what that is? That's actually a shower stall. And you notice that the shower control to turn on the water is right next to the edge of the door. And I took a picture of this at a hotel the other day, and I thought, wow, this is really great. I don't have to reach all the way in and get my arm wet when I'm turning on the shower. That's really great. So these kinds of things, we as software testers need to think about, when we're going through a user journey or going through a purchase path for a customer. And in terms of getting my arm wet, that's the same thing as error prevention. What kinds of things, how can we prevent errors? That's what it's really all about in terms of doing retail e-commerce testing, is really avoiding errors for the end user. And the last thing I'd like to talk about is observation-based tests. It's a lot easier than you think. And I say use the 80-20 rule. And what the 80-20 rule, the way it's applied to usability testing, is that if you look online and you look up Nielsen, you can actually do very accurate usability testing, observation-based usability testing with 5 users if you pick your users correctly. So you want to have users that are relevant to your domain. If you pick your users correctly, you can do very good usability testing with 5 users. And I just wanted to show a very simple usability lab that you can set up in your office in a little small room for a very low cost. And this is this is a schematic of the environment that I set up, where you have a laptop and on the right, and the laptop is connected wirelessly to a mobile phone, and you have a user there executing tasks on their mobile phone, and you give them the task to execute, buy this, go search for this product, things like that. And so your laptop is recording everything that they're doing. It's mirroring everything that they're doing on their mobile phone. And so you see that on the extra monitor off to the side, so that you're not interrupting the participant. But also your laptop there, you use the little webcam, and you record the person's face and gestures and emotions as they're going through that exercise. And it's really, really interesting what you can discover in just 5 minutes in having a user go through a scenario. And I've listed the websites of the software I use. I use Reflector, and Reflector works on the mobile phone as well as a Mac Pro, but also you can also have it on Windows and Android as well. And then I use a software called ScreenFlow, which I use to record the screen as well as record the user's gestures and face and emotions through the webcam. And this is a picture of me doing it for myself. You can see I'm recording myself. You know, I'm in wonderment there. Just can't believe this thing works so well and so cheaply. You can do all this for about you know, $100, $150 for the reflector software as well as the ScreenFlow software. There's a lot of different options out there. So let's close up. We're at 11:47, and so I just wanted to go through 5 main points here. You know, I think we've talked about this a lot in terms of the retail industry transforming and as being part of the digital transformation. And digital means software, and all these different little pieces and parts have to fit together. And the customer experience, we talked about that a little bit, you know, with respect to different examples in Starbucks, as well as Best Buy and Amazon and Whole Foods. And the whole experience is going to broaden and expand with different sensors and technologies. And so as software testers, we need to be aware of all the different APIs and connections and integrations between all these technologies. And, you know, as you can imagine, the permutations of these different things are infinite. And so as software testers, it's really up to us to understand the components, how they fit together, as well as what are the critical things to test, because we just can't test it all, as you know. And then the last thing I'd like to emphasize is that, you know, you really have to think about the domain and what you're selling and how the end users of one domain are not going to be the same end users of another domain. I mentioned the Zappos and the shoes, you know, 9 versus 9.5. You have a much smaller margin of error in the shoe industry. And so you have to know your end users and think about what they're buying. Not only that, but who they are, what their return tendencies are, how much they're going to share information about your product on social networks, and so on. So, you know, Dave, I think that's it. You know, you know, we can have Q&A now, and thanks very much for joining. Dave, is there any questions that have come in?
Yeah, and go ahead and type some into the questions box as well if you have additional questions beyond the ones we have in so far. So I think someone caught onto your slide just before this where it says permutations are infinite. And I think it's like, well, that's reassuring. So you know, the complexity of this can be overwhelming. The customer experience, e-commerce, security, physical delivery. You know, where do you start? How do you get your hands, you know, wrapped around this?
That's a good one. Yeah, I just spoke to a client about this just recently, and so what I told them that I thought we should start in terms of our automation would be, let's start with the things that could hurt you the most, or the things that you could make the most money. So
I like that.
Yeah, so you think about, you know, what are the things that I could get damaged easily, and what are the things that I could make the most money. So I would make sure that you know, payment in terms of getting damaged, and security in that area, as well as user information. And then in terms of making the most money, I would, you know, we need to really focus on the user experience in the purchasing transactions for the most expensive products and for the most frequently purchased products, and making those easy.
Oh, that's really good. That's really good. And you had mentioned, so you mentioned security. So I have a question: that how much of the security responsibility falls on the software testers, the QA, kind of department versus any other department or group or individual? So how much of the security falls on QA and testing versus anyone else?
Well, that's a good question. So in terms of, for us as software testers, I think that the whole payment transaction security is really in our laps, going through the payment gateway testing, as well as the actual testing on our individual sites. As far as the information security and protecting that, that's more of a DevOps or operations type responsibility. So that's kind of how I would divide it up.
Okay, good. When you were mentioning the whole idea of where to focus, one of the listeners commented that his team had requested they had requested historical e-commerce sales data for the last year, and that really helped them to analyze it and determine the 80-20 focus. So getting that data, getting the real data there, I think helps. Does that sound right?
Yeah, right. I mean, you want to know what your users are buying and what they're doing, and you want to test those particular things first. Of course, yeah. That's a good way to that's a good way to find that out as well.
So when you were talking about mobile, a couple of questions popped up right then. One was related to what you were using, what test tools or analytics you were using to determine what mobile devices that your users for that particular project were using. Do you have a favorite? Is there more than one way to approach determining what mobile devices and versions are being used?
Well, there's a lot of other than Google Analytics, there's a lot of different vendors out there that provide those kinds of tracking tools. I don't have any of those offhand though, but they're pretty easy to find. We use Google Analytics for our purposes, and we actually work with clients to insert Google Analytics code to discover those devices.
Right. Yeah, I think that's pretty common, and then the information coming out there is quite good. Another question related. Yeah, related to the mobile versus server defects breakdown, where you had and coincidentally, I think that was also maybe 80-20 or 70-30, something along those lines. How did you, when you asked that person to put together that chart, how is it that they were able to develop and identify that percentage origin? Had that been something that was being tracked previously, or is that something where you went back and looked at logs, or where did that number come from if someone wanted to try to do that on their end as well?
Yeah, so he just looked at all the defects and marked what the source of the error in those defects were. So, if we had 100 defects, he would just classify them as server issues or mobile rendering or mobile related issues, and did it that way. And so I thought it was quite interesting that, how important it is to test on the different devices.
Oh, no, I thought that was brilliant. Yeah. So a question, so going back near the beginning, there was a question, so when testing with lockers, you had asked, what are the types of things that we need to consider? And we had talked about networking security, the encryption. You had mentioned the scanning and whatnot. How much of the aspects of even the mechanical engineering, or can you get a package in and out, or is it the right size, or is the construction theft or vandal proof? How much of that should the tester be concerned about?
Yeah, I mean I think that's more of a bit of business analyst or marketing type problem. We, as testers, of course, we can think about those things and bring them up, but we should be more concerned about the about the embedded software and the locks and how we interface with those locks and get them open and close and know when they're open and closed. Those are the kinds of things that I think are important as far as packages or not. That's really well, actually I take that back. So there's going to be rules that we need to think about, business rules that are in the software, so that, for instance, we would add up all the package sizes, and we would have to have rules for adding the package sizes and whether or not they would fit in the cubic volume of the locker. So I'm sure that would be a business rule that we would have to test against.
Good point there, right? As the order's even coming through as to whether or not it can fit in there in the first place. Right. Yeah, and so also mentioned here, just the complexity. I think that people think it's easy just to drop off the package, but the security alerts, the package receipt alerts, and whatnot bring in, again, either more APIs, as you talked about, and the expertise that's needed in those, or just, different systems or different components of systems. That seems to be a very complex area.
Think about it. You have to receive messages on your mobile phone that something was delivered to, and it's just, that's another system, right?
Right. No, very complex. So,
yeah.
All right, so we'll wrap it up here. There's a slight breather in questions. If there are additional questions, you have your contact information there, so someone can reach out to you at services at, and they can reach you that way. We are recording this webinar, so we'll make that available here in just a few days on the ASTQB website. That's available to all comers. They can just simply fill out a small registration form and have access to that. And we'd really encourage you to share this with your other departments and other staff inside of your organizations. I think this is an important message. I really want to thank you for taking time to do this, Phil. This is far more enlightening and complex, I think, than the average person would consider, even just based on the title. There's a lot there, and if it feels overwhelming, it's only probably because it is, and you've given some great advice as to how to attack this. So, Phil, I want to thank you again for joining us.
Great. Thanks for having me, Dave.
And I want to thank the entire audience for listening in, and hope you can join us in future ASTQB webinars. Also, be sure to check out the ASTQB website for some related certifications that play into what Phil discussed today, including the ASTQB mobile certification. There's a usability certification, a performance certification, a security certification. So these will help you to not only develop, but also prove that you have the skills and knowledge in these areas. So we encourage you to check those out. Again, everything's at astqb.org. And with that, we will conclude today's webinar. Thanks again for joining us.